Welcome to the Core Outdoors podcast. My name is Christian Rawls. This podcast is aimed at helping people working within the outdoor industry by learning from each other. Each episode is a conversation with someone willing to share what they've learned so that we can benefit from their experiences. This podcast is brought to you by CORE, the Kootenay Outdoor Recreation Enterprise. CORE is a nonprofit organization based in the Kootenay region of British Columbia. CORE's mission is to support the growing network of gear and apparel makers and entrepreneurs within the Kootenays. Casey Shaw is a product designer who has played an important role in outdoor technical apparel design through his work at Cloudveil, Arcteryx, and Patagonia. There's a good chance that Casey has contributed directly or indirectly to one of your favorite pieces of outdoor apparel. I recorded this conversation with Casey a few months ago, and I've listened to it 3 times since then. Listening to Casey talk about his craft and about what he's passionate about is inspiring, it's informative, and it's a rare opportunity to hear someone who is a master craftsman talk about their process. I can't tell you how much I love this conversation. So much that I consider making a podcast that is just me phoning Casey every month and hitting record. During this conversation, I somehow felt simultaneously dumber and smarter at the same time, and I think it's a great thing. Here are just a few of the nuggets that you can expect to hear in this episode. The story of creating the Arcteryx Atom LT jacket, tuning race motorcycles by using a theory about sound and frequency, using cleverness to solve problems, designing the world's best down parka, why measuring is important as making, and Casey's theory of comfort. There are so many gems in this conversation. It's a bit longer than usual, but for good reason. There's no way I was going to trim this one down. So I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Without further ado, here is Casey Shaw.
Well, growing up in Canada, we just spent time outside. I remember when I was little, we always went to one of the lakes, and I grew up in Manitoba, so we'd go to the lake country, and it's kind of wonderful to think back about that. I just didn't think it was anything special. We just spent a lot of time outside. We had so much water and so much wood in those days. I remember that some of the campgrounds, you just drive around and like the wood was piled up already cut, and you just loaded your car and went back to the campsite. Like, you didn't pay for it or anything. It's part of the deal. You just spent time outside. I think that was an awesome age of innocence and super great way for a kid to just play around in the natural world and kind of go on discovery missions. And so I think it started with that because I grew up in the city. I grew up in Winnipeg. And so that just felt sort of right and magical. You're little, you don't think much about it at the time, but on some level that must have been like, yeah, just a resonant frequency for me as a person. So, yeah.
You eventually became a rock climber, which is interesting for growing up in Winnipeg.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I was super into like scuba diving, and I got licensed when I was a young teenager, and I was like, I'm going to be an oceanographer or an oceanologist or something and do something in the sea. And we'd go out to the lakes because I'd go diving. And then something along the way, like a book or some kind of exposure to climbing happened. And I didn't know there was any climbing in Manitoba. So I just started going to the library, and I started reading all these books in the history, like all the expeditions to Everest. It's funny because in school, I don't think I ever thought history was that enjoyable. But here I was, like, I always loved to understand, like, who the giants were that came before and, like, what feats of amazing fortitude and whatever they accomplished. And so I started doing that. And then one day, as a teenager, I wandered into an outdoor shop, right? Probably my first exposure to like a specialty outdoor shop. And they had, like, some carabiners and some stuff on the wall. And I was like, no way, why is there climbing gear? On a conversation and introductions, and eventually realized there were all these great cliffs in the Canadian Shield, right? This 2.5 billion-year-old granite, the bedrock of North America. And then I met a couple people who sort of like, started inviting me, and I'd always like call and pester people. Are you going out to Manaki this weekend? Blah, blah. Yeah. And so that started like just a complete course shift there of the mountains and climbing, and and that took over kind of everything for me.
That's funny. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and I had a very similar thing. I think I was like 14 or 15 and introduced to climbing, and then after that, I was the kid without a car who would just nag on all the older teenagers who had cars who would go climbing. Like, are you going outside climbing this weekend? And just nag until I could get a ride.
Yeah.
But that thing, that whatever that is that bites us, that doesn't let go of us, like calling for the mountains. So I'm curious where that took you after. So that calling of the mountains, did it actually take you? Typically we go west. Did it take you west, or what was the next step?
Yes. And it's funny, like you reminded me that, because when I was a teenager, a lot of it was that kind of more traditional period in climbing still, where a lot of professionals were the climbers, like a lot of scientists. And so the guys that I hung out with were all like professors at the university. And years later, one of them, very successful, said to me, actually, he lives in Canmore now, because there was always this thing about there are none so righteous as the newly converted, right? So when you discover this, you're telling all your friends, you're like, you got to come with me. I would like climb buildings in the city, like kind of wacky, dangerous stuff, My friends, it's like their hesitancy didn't really register. I was like, oh, this is amazing, And my friend Everett was like, years later, he said, oh, Casey, like the promotional thing. In the end, it's people, if they're really interested, they'll be like you. They'll just call and hound other folks for a ride and just keep at it, right? And that's ultimately kind of what determines who goes the distance. Or as one of the guru designers at Arcteryx used to tell me, he was like, oh, everybody wants to be a designer, but let's see who's stuck in 10 years, And so it's that same kind of thing. Like, you don't know, you don't have any idea when you're just starting out if it's a lifelong thing or if it's just a phase, but it's certainly, I caught the bug. Yeah. And because those early days I was reading about mountaineering, rock climbing was the tool and the technique that you use to be safe in the mountains. So we started going to the Canadian Rockies pretty early on, and just doing some of the classic North Faces and that kind of stuff. And yeah, so that's kind of was the transition. And
what is the catalyst that got you into the outdoor industry specifically?
Yeah, well, after sort of then, I went to university, and then I just started traveling around, and I realized, like, rock climbing in particular, that was a hard thing to do in Canada because it was definitely seasonal. And so I just started traveling. And the first time I traveled to Yosemite was with a bunch of folks from Calgary. Like, I'd driven out from Winnipeg with this friend who was friends. And he's like, oh, we'll stop at this house. Like, all these guys live in this hippie commune house together. And we're all going to go down with the cars and a chain and go to Yosemite. And I had read like Royal Robbins' Basic Rockcraft and like saw pictures. And I was like, I'm never going to climb there. Like, that's the place of gods and all these legends. And it's like, oh no, we're going to drive down, like just the caravan, And the irony was, or the coincidence was, that one of the guys in that house was Mike Blencarn, who went on to be one of the guys at Arcteryx who brought a lot of that technology we take for granted now, urethane treated zippers and adhesive gluing and thermal molding and all that stuff, was him. And he was just in the beginning living in Calgary. I think he was working at the Mountain Equipment Co-op. And yeah, he just was in that house. So years later, as I'm fishing around looking for work, right, there was like, oh, hey, I don't really know this guy, but we've met. I could reach out to him. And he was incredibly helpful for me in my journey. Yeah, kind of great how that goes around. But yeah, we went down there. I started traveling a lot, and then it was just like anybody would do, like odd jobs in the off season and trying to climb as much as possible. And then I moved to Telluride. I wanted to be there for the winter and ice climb because I was going to Nepal the next year. So I wanted to just train and be ready to go. And while I was living there, I met Terry Herscher, the owner of the Telluride Mountaineer. And I was the beginning of plastic telly boots and stuff. And so he was really the kind of core shop. And he was interested in bringing in more climbing gear. And I was cragging around in town. And he said, hey, do you want to go to OR and like look around and maybe help me just suggest what I should put on the wall? And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. I had no idea. And so I went to my first outdoor retailer and came back, and he bought some stuff. And And then I wandered around for years again. And then in Santa Fe, again, through friends, it's always the world is small, right? And another friend was moving to town, a friend of a friend who wanted to open up an outdoor shop. And he didn't really know anybody in Santa Fe. And it was like, so he sort of hired the two of us and then a couple other folks. And like, so all of a sudden I'm in specialty retail in a climbing shop, right? And we're making all the mistakes you make and like buying gear we can't sell. And so you learn the industry that way. And then you start to meet all the reps and you take them climbing when they're visiting or skiing or whatever it is you're doing. And yeah, and so that was the immersion. And I just met all these great characters. And to make the story more complete, that was the intro to the industry. And then like becoming a designer is sort of a longer story, but it was just the natural outgrowth because I'd been tinkering with stuff, I mean, right from the get-go, right? And of course, it's always somebody else who sees the obvious, but Christina, my wife, was like, you're always designing stuff, you're always making stuff, and you're always tinkering with stuff in the outdoors, whether it was like taking a Gravel ice pick and bolting it onto a carbon fiber Black Prophet and changing the pick angle and going, wow, what angle would be better? Like, and why don't they make forged picks over that kind of stuff, right? And she was like, why don't you do that for a living? Instead of like, you're in the industry, but you're doing all this wacky stuff. And so that was kind of the start of the design career. And then I, kind of used some of those connections to help me, including just reaching out to Blencarn at Arcteryx and being like, hey, Mike. And he'd be like, call this guy. He'll send you some glue. Tell him I told you to like blah, blah, blah. So I'd be like, I'd start buying sewing machines and have little stuff in the garage and then making things and just that, which felt totally normal to me. It's what I'd kind of always done. But now it's like, oh, hey. And I'd see him at the trade show and I'd be like, can I show you this like little pack I made for like doing long free routes? And he'd be like, sure. And here's how you strap the shoes on so they don't fall off when you go into this, all that kind of stuff. Right.
So you're just basically designed by scratching your own itch the entire time.
Yeah. In the end, I think that kind of thing is a mindset more than a skill set. And it was Christina who really just pointed out, hey, you do this all the time. You're always modifying things. It doesn't matter what it is, like things for the house, tools, like you just, in my motto years, because I ended up doing, right, the path there was, when you look back, it's easy to see how the dots connect when you look back over your shoulder. But in the beginning, you have no idea where the dots are going, right? And so like I tuned Grand Prix road race motorcycles. So we travel around, I'd be on the track at Daytona. And it's that same learning curve. You're like, I don't think gear ratios are appropriate for this fast track. Well, we've never split the cases before. Should we do? And then once you open up Pandora's box and you do it once, you're like, oh yeah, like every race. So it got to the point where people talk about like with two strokes, how you try to get the jetting right, the carburation right, the mixture ratio of the air and fuel. And you can look at the spark plug, but if you really want to know, you need to look at the top of the piston. So it got to the point where you're just so comfortable taking things apart that the racer would come in, who's a buddy of mine, and you do a thing called a plug chop where you hold the engine at full throttle and then you just kill it and you glide back into the pits so that you preserve how the burn pattern when it was at full speed, full power. And like come back into the pits, drain the water out, blah, blah. You'd have the heads off the engine in like 15 minutes and be able to look directly at the top and go, oh, we're touch lean. I think we could go one jet up, and so same sort of thing. It was like, then I'd look at the suspension. I'd be like, hey, I don't think the rising rate linkage is blah, 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 or the two-stroke expansion chambers. Like I read a book on harmonics, on physical waves, and we should change this. We should have a special set of pipes for going to Road America, that kind of thing.
Hold on. So are you a self-taught bike mechanic?
Yeah. I mean, that stuff was all just, and not surprisingly, like I was always interested in science. Not always. Of course, I was Canadian, so I played hockey. Well, you got to play hockey, or you're not really male and Canadian, probably, but
constitutionally obligated.
And I definitely, when I was probably 9 or something, I was like, I'm definitely playing in the NHL. Like, that is my future for sure.
Sure.
But yeah, these things, as I say, the dots connect in peculiar ways. Yeah, like all kinds of odd jobs like that, making jewelry for artists in Taos for a year or whatever it was, right? Like, and so that's where it's like, oh, right. You've always just modified stuff, made stuff, tinkered with stuff, right? So it's just sort of built into the DNA. And
I'm really curious because that's a very unique skill set or group of skill sets. What are the things that and maybe you saw them early on in life, or maybe it was through the help of your wife to help you recognize? What are the individual skills that you have, or this maybe unique capabilities and abilities that you have that you bring to each one of those different projects, whether it's tuning race bikes or it's modifying your ice axes or it's fixing stuff around the house? How do you recognize what these specific things are that you're uniquely capable of that probably other people may not have?
it's one of those things I'm cautious about describing because now I'm finally at a place where people ask me, or young designers or people who want to start a product business will call me. And I always take those calls because I feel folks helped me along the way. And that's definitely the way to navigate the world, is to make time to help other folks. Because like you never know who the next Wayne Gretzky is going to be, right? And in those early days when I would be calling people and be like, oh, the Bemis rep, could you send me some of these thermoplastic adhesives? And Mike Blankhorn told me to call you. And they'd send, like, years later, fast forward, right? Christine and I are in Japan skiing, and we're at this little place, and we're at breakfast, bed and breakfast. And I hear somebody yell across the room in the morning, hey, Casey. And I'm like, we're in Japan. There aren't really any Americans where we were. And it turns out it was this guy, Arnie, who was the rep. And I was like, hey, Arnie, like, it's great to run into you. I really wanted to thank you for, like, you didn't know who I was. I was just a guy in his garage, right? And you started sending me all these samples, and I would always say thank you and show you what I'd made. Like, you don't have any idea what's going to come of that, right? And he was super gracious, and just, that was the world we lived in. And you don't know who's going to be successful and who's going to be that next sort of artist or whatever. And so he was like, yeah, that was kind of a pleasurable time in the industry of, it's just sort of how it worked. Everybody helped everybody. But to answer your question, when I'm having those conversations and trying to give back in that way, I talk about what I think contributed to my success, like what those elements are. But it's also really, really important to be careful, right? Because no two people are the same. So the formula that worked for me may not work for somebody else.
Sure.
And it's when you get like really competent at something, I mean, I think the greatest pitfall for anyone is you start to believe a little bit too much in your own myth or rhetoric. And it's always good to, like, even if somebody who's a neophyte asks you a question, you kind of consider sort of like, oh, that's sort of basic. You should know the answer. Something may have changed. And so I always take the time, and I kind of always liked working with younger designers because they'd ask me like, oh, why don't we do a radiant heat block thing? And like, we could just have a space blanket. Wouldn't that be warm enough? And it's like, okay, well, let me walk you through how heat loss works. But you're trying not to be condescending. And so I kind of like that because something inevitably happens in those conversations where I just go, I did all this research that I'm sharing years ago. Has anything actually changed? Because now we have aerogel. So maybe you incorporate that and it changes the outcome of the formula that you've been living by for the last however many years. And all of that is framework for what do I think was specific for me to do what I do. And it's a variety of things. Like one of them is physiological sensitivity, right? So when people do this kind of research of how to design things, I'm always really afraid of like, how can an external organization or individual do research for you to help you improve your product? Like, the best way to make better products is to be a core user of the product yourself. that's not quite enough, but it's like a really great head start, particularly when you start to factor in like, oh, you notice things that other people don't seem to notice, or you just love gear, or you love solving problems. Like the curiosity is so driving for you, you'll stop doing something, including in the middle of a ski run. You can go, okay, I just got to stop, even though that was amazing, because I got to check this thing. And others have told me, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be testing gloves, but if I skin up and they're in my pack and it's warm enough, I'm just going to do a lap and not even bother taking out the 2 gloves. And just, so you have to develop, like, yeah, and that discipline isn't even really discipline, because you can't help yourself, right? You just want to be like, how does this work? And why is it different than this other one? Like, I don't understand, and I'd like to understand. So part of that is just how you come into the world, right? Like, it's just and that's why I say like mindset rather than skill set. You can develop skills, but you have to want to actually get better at certain skills. And so one of the things that's worked really well for me, and it's a story I like to tell, is physiologically, I'm just quite sensitive. If we're talking about how to make a better trail running shoe, people are always like, oh, like, what more could you do? And I'm like, oh man, there's just tons of things. Like, I hate getting sand and little pebbles in my shoes. And there are so many ways you could experiment. You could do it with socks, but it could be built in. I would trail run in a thin split skin leather upper just to avoid any dust, because Christine will be like, wait, that tiny pedal is why you stopped to take off your shoe? You know, she's like so much tougher than I. And it's just, but that's the reason. Like, I noticed like, oh, right. Yeah. If I retrofit a BOA system onto one shoe, it's really cool. But maybe you can't afford a BOA system because you're making a mid-priced product. Like, but what did you learn using that you could incorporate in a different way? So there are just tons of ways you can improve trail running shoes. And that curiosity, that wanting to know how things work is part of it. And then the other part that's really important, as I said, is the physiological sensitivity. I don't remember this, but my mother would tell me the story that when I was still really little, where I couldn't get dressed on my own, and she'd be putting like my socks on, and you know how there's the little seam at the end of the toes. And she was like, if she didn't line that up perfectly, like I'd be all fussy and like, this is not on here, right? You know? So like it started again, like I didn't do anything to develop that. It's just how I came into the world. But I've used that as a tool. So for folks who maybe that's more of a struggle, my advice is just be conscious of it. Like, try to develop it to the degree that you can, because stopping and noticing things is what helps you then have breakthrough ideas. And so, yeah, it's a host of skills. It's curiosity. It's that physiological. And then it's also like just being mechanical and solving problems with your hands, right? Like, the use of the hands unlocks the higher cognitive functions of the mind. And so those two are kind of linked. And again, if you have that as a natural capacity, I think that's really helpful. And so, yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff. And then, of course, the people and the resources you have access to and the opportunities that come your way, all of that stuff is what, if you're resilient, I think that's what helps you eventually become successful.
Yeah. It's really interesting how this is for all of us, but it's interesting to learn more about how your background and your curiosities and all these things. It's amazing how, like you said, back to the dots, like all these dots in our past can kind of form together to create this really interesting adventure that is life. In a previous conversation, you said something that has really stuck with me since, and you said innovation is just about starting with really good problems. Do you remember what the first problem that you got to solve kind of like professionally inside the outdoor industry? Do you remember what that problem was that you wanted to go solve? Because you're solving your own problems every day in the garage, but like, what was the first one you got to solve for the market?
Yeah, I don't know maybe what the first one was, but I'll tell you one that's been impactful. And I think it's really important for all of us, because it was like trying to understand really what comfort is. So we talk about waterproof, or we talk about breathability, right? And in waterproof jackets, it's waterproof, breathable. But what does that really mean, right? And so one time I was climbing in the fall, late fall, in the City of Rocks, and it started snowing, and of course, I had a little micro puff from Patagonia everybody had. And for me, that was like, I would always ask people, like, what do you think is a genius product? Because I'm always curious. And like, even now, like when I go into retail shops, I'm like, what's the best product you have on the wall that has impressed you in the last year or two that you brought into the shop? And like the guys at Alpenglow Sports in Tahoe City, I remember Jeff saying, oh, this Catadine filter in this squish bottle, because like you can go on trail runs now and you don't, I was like, wow, something simple like that for him was like a really breakthrough product, right? And so for me, I gave Patagonia credit for the micro puff, and why it was such a genius product for me was everybody made big, heavy, puffy jackets, whether down or synthetic, but nobody thought to make a sweater weight insulated product, right? One that was more applicable to the sports that we do. Like, I think we approached in the early parts of the outdoor industry, like comfort as a survival component. So what's the worst could happen? You need a big down puffy to survive, right? But the truth is, like, those are good for stop and go activities. You know, if you're ice fishing, yeah, you're not moving, you're not generating. But most of the activities we're talking about in our little piece of the world, these are sports that include forward motion most of the time, right? And so what do we really need? We need something that's sweater weight. We may carry something warmer in the pack, but that's not really a functional product. That's a product that you only put on when necessity dictates, but you don't use it 90% of the time, right? So after ski touring, you have a warm jacket because something can go wrong and somebody can break a leg and blah, blah. And you might be sitting on your pack for an hour having lunch somewhere on a cold day, but you don't have that to make you comfortable during the activity phase, right? And so I think we designed for the wrong phase of our activities. We were designing for this sedentary portion of the dance program. Anyway, so I was climbing in the City Rocks and it started snowing, and I had the puffball and I had it on at the belay. And I'm like, man, we used to call it the puffball of aestheticism because it was just remarkable that that little thing could provide that much warmth. But then like you'd start climbing the next pitch and you'd overheat like a lunatic. And climbing for me still remains the best crucible for testing gear because it is one of those sports that's a little more like all out and then you're stopped. And like in the winter, if you're ice climbing, it's like, well, you're leaning against the ice while you're belaying. And then like you're super attentive, maybe a little concerned, and you're sweating and, you know, it's like, wow, two extremes. So if you find things that are comfortable for those, you know, that pendulum swing of comfort, you're onto something. And so, yeah, I'm climbing and I'm thinking, man, what if this puffball, I didn't have to take it off right before I start climbing the pitch? Because then I'm like cold for the first half and then I'm comfortable for the last. What if I could put this thing on and leave it on, which of course later became the tagline at Patagonia for the Nano Air. And that led me, at the time I was working at Arcteryx, that led me to go back and start building these prototypes. And I love this story because I teased my boss a little bit because at the time he was like, I don't really get the concept, you know, what are you doing? And I was taking insulation in and like cutting it with scissors so it was thinner and just doing wacky stuff to make the concept, right? And that ended up becoming the Atom LT, right? Which was just sort of like kind of the first modern, what we call active insulation piece now on the market and like the first really successful paradigm shift. And it's really no different in a way than what we'd done, what Cloudveil did with, where I also worked with soft shell with the Serendipity jacket in the early part. But it's just a different way to execute it. And the name had gotten co-opted and, diluted and stuff. So active insulation is kind of where the press and everyone has landed now as a descriptor. But yeah, that was the beginning of that. So that was a big one for me because, you know, it was born out of my experience, lack of comfort, paying attention to it and having that idea, like, what if I could just keep this on the whole time, right? And how would I do that? And I used the materials we had and made this sort of hybridized thing that worked really quite well. But the whole time I knew I needed the whole thing to be air permeable. And that's when I started down a whole rabbit hole of like, what is the definition of comfort and how do you use these parameters to influence comfort? And then when I went to Patagonia, you know, years later, the materials technology changed that finally allowed me to make these prototypes where the whole jacket was air permeable, not just panels. And that was the Nano Air. And I have to say that was one of those, like, that's where you're like, oh yeah, our marketing team is pretty strong. Like, put it on, leave it on is a great tagline. So, but yeah, I mean, that's one that, and has been since that time, since the Atom, like a continual commitment for me, kind of a, something I've always continued to work on and try to understand how air permeability and other factors, density and things affect human comfort, and depending on the temperature and your metabolic output and all of those things, and try to come up like with a formula and things like that, right? Like, is this scientifically explainable and how would you do that? So yeah, so that's an early one that I was like, oh yeah, okay. And yeah,
that's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. Made Arcteryx a lot of money, So when the boss was finally like, oh, I got it, I get it. We green light this, let's turn it into a product, it's like, okay, here we go. And that was one of those rare ones where I knew like it would be a good price for an Arcteryx product and it would be super functional. The foundation was based on true performance and functionality, and yet it didn't have to cost a ton of money to execute it. And that's a rare gift when that happens, right? Like a lot of times you got to spend more money. And that was one of those where it was still a premium product. I mean, everything out of Patagonia or out of Arcteryx was and is a premium product. And yeah, so that's when I ended up spending more time, is like, what kind of construction techniques could I do that pay homage to the fact that Arcteryx is this premier brand? It was like, I want it so that when you flip the jacket inside out, it's as beautiful on the inside as it is on the outside, right? And that ended up informing the construction and what it ended up looking like. So,
how long was that process from you're climbing in City of Rocks to the Atom LT hits the market?
I don't remember exactly, but I think it probably was only like 6 months of making prototypes and testing them and then giving to other folks to use. And then people go, wow, this is amazing. Like, it really does work. It's not just a gimmick. So the realization that we had something and that we should turn it into a product was probably 6 months, right? Because as soon as you try it, you kind of go, yeah, it's way better. And then, and then you go into the design cycle. So that's usually 1.5 to 2 years for most brands, right? Like it's just a shame, but that's how long the design cycle is. So,
yeah. And were you having to develop new materials along the way, or are you taking pre-existing stuff and just putting it together in a way that was unique to your design?
Yeah. I mean, all the materials honestly did exist. It was just about knowing what to combine and how, and then looking for alternative materials, because I couldn't do everything I wanted to do at that time. Like I said, and one of those big ones was we didn't have insulation that was migration resistant the way we do now. And that was a big pivot. So those prototypes I made the concept the way I wanted it. And you'd see after a while wearing it, all the little white polyester fuzz on the inside, the insulation would poke through the fabrics, and you'd see all these little white balls on the outside. And it looked kind of like, what's going on with that, right? And then you realize you can't sell a product that does that. That's just not going to fly. But if you were just talking about, does it work? Oh yeah, it was amazing, right? So then it was like, okay, I need to convince, one of the insulation companies that we can do that. And in the end, we used our sort of proprietary, the Thermatech insulation that we had spun our own little unique DNA into in a lightweight version. Still not migration resistant, but better than most of the other ones. And so that's why we chose that. But that's why I did this zonal thing, because at the time I didn't have a solution, but I always knew that's what I wanted to do. And then when you fast forward, all of a sudden, because in the beginning you go to an insulation company, you're like, I want to do this thing. Well, that's a research project. Who's paying for that? How long does it take? And nobody really believes that you have a vision of the future that's going to come true. They're like, what does this guy know? He's just a designer, And yeah, he works for a good company, but when you come to market with something, then people go, oh, and you start to see that market segment grow. You're like, ooh, there's an opportunity for the materials companies to benefit. So then they start developing, and now you have a number of things you can choose from.
It's an amazing product. It's both the products you made at Arcteryx and at Patagonia are all still in my closet and use them regularly. And it's amazing what few pieces of gear you need when they're good, right? Like this morning, we're recording this at the end of July, and I wore an Airshed pullover from Patagonia, right?
Yeah.
I will also wear that same jacket in January on a skin track. It's just amazing. I only need one of those, right? I don't need this like quiver of pieces. It's amazing where the technology's gone.
You remind me of this concept that I haven't been able to explain, so I'll say it, but it may not resonate, which is I think people try to make things versatile. And typically if that's the design strategy you have from the outset, what it usually means is it does everything kind of poorly. I mean, that's just the nature. That's what I've observed anyway. And there are exceptions, and ironically, and I don't know how to explain this, I'm struggling with this one still, but when I start out with a really specific goal, like this is the only thing I'm interested in, I just need this thing to perform in this way, I would say 7 or 8 times out of 10, it turns out to be an incredibly versatile piece. So that's been a really unconscious but successful strategy for me, is try to solve something and make it best in class. And it generally ends up being really good at a bunch of stuff. Whereas if you try to make something good at a bunch of stuff, you generally fail at it being good at anything, right? And I don't know exactly why it works out that way. I'm struggling, but that has been my experience. And so, yeah, I just try to make, if it's a pack and you want to climb the nose in a day, well, what would you do just to do that? And you make that pack just to climb the nose in a day, it'll end up being like super useful for something else, right? So
that's interesting.
And I don't know why, but it's been my experience.
There must be something about maybe there's something about mastery in there, like that can trickle down, whereas building for the masses there is no trickle down when you build for the masses, but there is trickle down when you build for mastery.
Yeah. Yeah, with gravity, it's hard to trickle up, right? So you start at the top, generally things trickle down, yeah.
Yeah. Working at large companies like Arcteryx and Patagonia and there's other brands that do the same thing. There's innovation. Like, how do you foster innovation at that level of that size? Like, what are the key components from your experience that you could take from a large, big brand like that, and then also bring those elements of innovation straight down back to the guy who's in the garage?
Yeah. This is, I think, one of the most difficult concepts. And, if you want to be innovative, it's a struggle even to define what that means, right? And to bring it to bear in a company is really difficult. So I think it's like you really need to know how to manage the gray area. And where do you train for that, right? Like, where do you go to school to be a generalist, somebody who can like operate in the murky shadows, but keep things on track, like spend money when you need to, but be conservative the rest of the time. Use cleverness to solve problems, not money. And it all starts with passion, right? Same thing when I'm having conversations, I always ask, like, are you passionate about this idea as your startup business? Because as soon as it gets hard and like the power company's going to like threaten to shut off the lights because you haven't paid the bill in a while, you're going to give up. But if it's something you're passionate about, you might struggle through that really difficult phase and actually make it out the other side. And innovations like that, in that it must be just part of the DNA. So what I think happens a lot of the time is one brand sees another brand be successful in innovation and reads their marketing copy. And so they're like, we got to have an R&D facility. But if you're not truly dedicated to the process and you don't really understand what the process looks like, because maybe personally, if you're in the decision-making seat, it's not a path you've chosen for yourself, it's going to be really hard for you to manage that and make it successful. Because the first time something becomes a little bit costly, you'll want to pull the plug. Or you may have a really good idea, but you haven't realized that sometimes really good ideas take 3 years to gain inertia. And so on year 2.5, you shut down the program just when it's about to take off and change the industry, right? Or change a product performance or a category. And you just, like, all of that stuff, there is no formula. Like, you just have to operate in uncertainty. And so I think it takes years. Like, first you need to manage it well. So, and you need to, and the passion and belief in the idea that you're going to commit time and resources to it have to exist at a high level within the company. Otherwise, you're just paying homage, credit to those who have done it successfully, but you're never really going to be successful at it. It becomes more of a marketing sort of story than an actual commitment, right? And there are ways to gauge that, to gauge your authenticity, I think, in that process. For me, there are always like little litmus tests. You're like, oh, tell me about that. Or one of those is like, yeah, if I were to, in the day of magazine subscriptions, like zoom in to your place and see what your subscriptions are, it would tell me a lot about where your passions are. Like if you've got a mountain biking magazine subscription, it's pretty clear to me that that's really important to you, right? And you're studying and there's a book on the table about so-and-so, a biography. It's like, but it starts to unfold. And that's true for anything, including innovation. You can kind of, when you ask the right questions, you look around the room, you can see how committed somebody or an organization is to the process. And so, yeah, I think for most people, great book on this with Lockheed Martin and the Skunk Works about, because I read that book because I was like, wait, how did they do that through a change in management through multiple decades? Because to do it for a short period of time is not unusual, but usually when the personalities and the structure changes, then it's no longer successful because humans are funny, right? We're creatures of habit. And so you set up a process and procedure that works great. I call this time and place. You're in the right time at the right place. All the elements align and it's magic and everything works. And all it takes is 2 or 3 key positions to change. And you're like, I don't understand why it's not working. We're still doing the same procedure that we've done in the past. And so the answer in this long-winded way is that the definition of how to do innovation is always morphing and changing. And you just need to have a feel for it. And if you're going to have somebody run it for you, you need to be good at hiring people such that you can sense they have a capability of operating in this murky, uncertain zone. Because there's no Excel spreadsheet you can run that says, this is how much this department costs us, and this is how much it contributes to the bottom line, right? Yeah. You can do rough sketches, but you just can't ever get super concrete numbers. And you should do the rough sketches. You should still try to put numbers in. It should never be an excuse not to do the math. You should do the math and you should justify it, but it's got to start with belief, right?
I was going to say there's a bit of a catch-22 because it seems like early innovation tends to come from startups, but big brands, the ones who have the budgets to cultivate it. So it's one of those things where you see somebody hits a break and hit the market with something that's really innovative, and you can start to see that lull, right? That now our innovations turn into more of a marketing. Like sometimes I think innovation moves in inches. We're just variations of a theme that's already come before us. Whereas there's times where it seems like the big, let's call it innovation that moves in miles, could sometimes come from the guy who's tinkering in the garage or the woman who's tinkering in the lab that just they didn't have the constraint. They had more constraints that forced them to really explore things deeper. Do any examples come into your mind? I mean, the Atom LT is definitely one of them, but do any examples come to your mind of kind of those innovations that have moved us further by the mile as opposed to the inch?
Yeah. I mean, again, like for me, the sort of genius products are the ones that, in some way are actually relatively easy to achieve and have a fairly profound impact. And so understanding how air works and how it relates to comfort, like when we made the Atom LT, it was always interesting to me that the other brands didn't really copy it right away. And then when they did, it was more like, oh, we're just going to dip our toe in here and go at this gradually. Like the best analogy is the sort of the width of skis, right? Like back in the days when we're skiing tour skis that are 65 millimeters underfoot, somebody makes a 105 and you go, that's incredible. But what does the ski come out next year? 69 millimeters underfoot, and then 72. And then it takes a decade to get where you are. And that's the problem when you don't do innovation for yourself. If you're not creative and you're not solving for these problems you've identified, if you copy other people, you're way more conservative about it because it's a risk, right? And you're already risk averse, or you would be innovative, right? You never quite catch up. Every once in a while you do. It's like two waves. Occasionally they get close to each other and then they start to separate again. But yeah, I mean, even to this day, like when I look around at all the products on the market, I can see, of course, I'm projecting my own bias a little bit, but I can see where I think, they haven't quite caught on to this little tidbit of knowledge here. They're tickling it, but they haven't quite got it yet, And so I see that in that realm of active insulation a lot, right? The air shit is just one of those things. It's like, why would you make a wind shirt and poke a bunch of holes in it? Like, it's antithetical, right? You're like, what, but that's where, like, when you start looking at comfort, you start to realize, right. And then you put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So I think that wasn't really what you asked me, but I think we probably did touch on this. Risk leads to breakthroughs. Breakthroughs build companies. And then when companies become successful, they become risk averse. So it's funny cycle, right?
Yes.
So how do you not fall into that as you become successful and larger? And one of it, of course, is just to be aware of that cycle and maintain a commitment in your product side to always spend some of your resources to trying to do unusual things. You had asked me to think about innovation, like what is it as a, because everyone defines it a little bit differently. Like, is it the big breakthrough, right? Or is it this iterative process that brings refinement over time that leads to something just as influential and impactful as the big breakthrough, but it doesn't seem like it because it takes time, right? For me, managing airflow as a way to achieve comfort, it's such a simple concept that it doesn't seem like a big breakthrough. But if you think about it in the impact on comfort, for me, it's like one of the bigger breakthroughs in my use of gear in my lifetime compared to anything else I can think of, like way more impactful than the concept of waterproof breathables, because waterproof breathables are barely, I would argue they're not really breathable, right? The way in which we measure them, we can measure differences, and we debate. A 10% improvement of 3% of a pie is essentially nothing, right? So like improving the pie by 20%, that's huge, but 20% of 3% is not. And so it's funny, like it doesn't necessarily come off that way because it isn't groundbreaking in a way that's visual but if you're talking about being comfortable while you're moving outside, like that's kind of one of my interview questions that I ask people as a like curiosity about their level of where they are in the understanding of that is like, what do you think the ratio between static and dynamic layers should be in your closet, right? And it's not that there's a right answer. It's just have you thought about it? Because if you have, you've probably got an answer, right? That idea of innovation, right? It's both of those things. It's big breakthroughs. And if you have a couple of those in your life, you're incredibly fortunate, right? Because they're very rare.
Sure.
But it's also this just chipping away at it and being dogged and believing in something and seeing opportunity and just keeping at it. And recently, I think for me now, I realized I don't think I define it through either of those anymore. Now I just look at the process. And for me, innovation just on a personal level feels like, this search for sublime balance in things. And that for me is innovation, because the most impressive things for me are actually the most complex things. And it's something we struggle with because we like sound bites and we like to reduce things down to their kind of simpler elements sometimes. The problem is, like, all the things I admire most, I realized, are quite complex. But because the balance of all of the disparate elements that make this thing work are so finely honed and work together in harmony that externally it's pretty simple, right? Or it feels simple to the average person. But if you pop the hood and look under the hood, you realize, oh my God, this is incredibly complex. The car is an example I often use where it's a relatively simple thing for most people. Like you get in, you turn the key and you drive to work, right? But if you start thinking about like, you got to like mine minerals and make metals and smelting and body panels and robots and just what does an ionized field look like in a stoichiometric air fuel ratio? And when do you time that so you achieve maximum pressure in the cylinder at the right time? And like, what should the connecting rod ratio be? Which all that stuff is incredibly complex and it all has correct answers. And those answers change depending on how it interfaces with the thing next to it, right? And so for me, that's innovation, is working on the balance of all those things. And yeah, it's magic when it comes together. And the outcome is that it's like, wow, this thing just works really well. Like I just pull this cord and this thing works. So that's kind of how I think about innovation now, is just the search rather than it's this or it's that. It's the journey, which is an overused cliche, but yeah, no, it turns out I think that's kind of what it means for me now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's kind of going back to solving interesting problems. And interesting problems for me may be different from interesting problems for you, right?
Yeah.
Problems I have are going to be different than the problems you have based on where we live and the climates we act in and the sports we like to do in those. Our mutual friend Rob Owens mentioned this. I was saying that I'm talking to you about having this conversation, and he was like, you got to ask him about the down parka at Patagonia. But I'm just curious what this story is, because he did send it to me in text, and I was like, this sounds interesting. Let's go.
Yeah. Oh, no, we can totally talk about it. It was on the market for a number of years, and I think it got remade in the last year. Yeah, that was one of those. I mean, that's the beauty of my time at Patagonia and being able to work in and manage the R&D team, was because it's a family-owned business, and the Chenards were interested. I mean, he has a product background, right? Like he's a product guy. And he doesn't have necessarily there is a board, of course, but it's still a family business. And so if Yvonne comes to you and he's like, I really want to make sure we're making product that's authentic and best in class, it's genuine, right? It's not somebody from senior management going, I think it'll look good in our marketing for next year's catalog. So to work in an environment like that, obviously, I have deep gratitude for that opportunity, right? And yeah, the parka was great because basically the gentleman I work for now, this incredible scientist, Scott, and my boss who invited me to Patagonia to work in the forge, in the R&D, when they decided to like sort of resurrect that and have an innovation lab at Patagonia again. Randy Harward is a remarkable individual in that, yeah, he was just that kind of person. He'd be like, yeah, clean sheet of paper. If you were going to make the world's best down jacket, what would you do? Like, don't worry about the cost or anything. And as a designer or a problem solver, it's rare you get an opportunity. Like people don't say, yeah, don't worry about like all the externalities. Just like, what would that look like? Right. And so we started on a bunch of us, and like, it was like, you know, it's like, I was totally in my element, and there's a classic cast of characters there. They're phenomenal, like Richard Siburel and, you know, and Kevin D, who I worked with, and who went on to like do the bags as an outgrowth of that as well. And, but yeah, so I just started thinking about it as this 3-dimensional thing. And cause you hear the stories of like, oh, we sold to our Asian partners to import Patagonia. And if they can stick a chopstick in between the corner, between, you know, the baffle and the next baffle, they don't think that's perfection. You know, which I was like, right on. Like, even if from a practical standpoint, down's probably not going to migrate from one channel to the other because the hole's pretty small. or a chopstick sized hole. Still, it's like, well, that's true. It isn't fully sealed off from the other chamber, and that's not quite right. So it was just like, go all the way back to the beginning and start thinking about it and thinking about, the term differential cut in sleeping bags. Like, what does that mean for jacketing? How does the hood bolt on? And then again, just, it's my natural aesthetic. And of course it was reinforced at Arcteryx. Like, how do you make things really beautiful at the same time? And sometimes if you start really looking under the covers, you can go, oh, I can make it lighter, use less material, and still make it beautiful and clean finished, right? But if you're not looking for that, you won't solve the problem in that way. You'll just add more materials to cover up the raw edges over there, right? And it's like, oh, well, more materials might be like, it weighs more, it doesn't pack as much, it's less breathable. Like, they're just all these things. And when you start to see how, again, the interstitial sort of spaces between all these layers and how they fit together, like, that's the most important part for kind of having breakthroughs. So we worked on that for a long time. We came up with a new way to sew these things to try to, because also it's like, well, how's the factory going to build this thing? Great, we can build one, but how's our partner going to do this, right? And that whole process was just like wonderful for me, because I knew it was really complex, but we could do it. And we refined it to a technique for construction that we thought the factory could do it. And we went over, and it was really great to, like, if you get invited into the sample room to help the problem solving process, like, that's super rare in the way it works now. Usually you're in the separate room and they bring you stuff to look at, you talk about it, but you're not out there. But at some point during the week of handing this off, there was a lot of like, hey, what was our thinking here and how did we do that? And eventually they were like, why don't you just come back here? So it's like, instead of running back and forth. And then it was like, at one point, I think the people who work in the sample room are the best of the best, right? They have the best sewers in there and the best folks, because they want to make your sample right, and they want so that you love it and you sign off on it. And they were struggling with one of these little trick construction techniques. And so I was trying to be like really respectful. I'm like, is it okay if I sit down at your sewing machine? It was just, I could see she was like, not sure if that was copacetic, But I sat down and I was like, well, you do this here, you stop here, you fold this thing over, and then you keep going, right? And they were like, oh, that's really pretty simple. And then everybody's talking and it's really fun. And so at that point, it was like, oh, you just come back every day and help solve problems, right? Like, just the pattern guide, walk over, I look over his shoulder, like, well, hold on. Like, if you do that, we've got that proportion is inverse there. You got to flip that around. And we want that variegated baffle to be over here, not over there. And so in the end, it turned what is a complex product into a relatively, I think, smooth process. So yeah, like, for me, that was one of the funnest projects. And we ended up making an incredible, to this day, like, it's just, you can't see that on the outside. And that's the problem. Like, you kind of need to x-ray it, right? And like, the whole upper part of the jacket would like pull through one of the draft tube on the front collar so that I could hide all of the raw seams. Like, you would see nothing. It would just look super beautiful, right? And it took me a long time to figure out how to do that. And would the whole jacket fit into this tiny little tube? And did you have to make the tube too big in order to do that? And then it doesn't really work and it gets caught in the zipper and back and forth, right? So again, like, that's the sublime balance of like, you're sitting at the mixing board in the recording studios and you don't just throw all the knobs up to 10, right? Like, you got to find just which one should be at 2.5 and which one's at 9. And then you have something approaching what I would call perfection, right? And that's when you get to work on a project like that, it was incredible. And it is expensive, but for what you get, like, people would always be like, well, that's kind of expensive. I think it was $800. And I'd be like, yeah, Christian, if you came to my shop in Santa Fe, we could make a waterproof, breathable, like a Gore-Tex shell together in a week. Like, with my help, you could build a coat in a week, including like gluing in zippers and all the super sophisticated stuff, right? But if we wanted to make that down jacket together, it would take us 5 weeks. So if you think about like the complexity and the time, what you're getting for $800 it's actually worth, like, it's probably a $3,000 down coat, right? So, and that's just one of those things that people, as a consumer, you don't have visibility into, it just seems like, wow, that's really expensive. And I get it. Like, of course, it means not everybody can afford to buy one. But yeah, that was a fun project. It helped inform the next things that we did. So that thing ended up paying off by allowing us to think about sleeping bags in a slightly different way. Not a massively dramatic way, but in my opinion, we made better sleeping bags as a result of that. So Kevin D did that, and he deserves the credit on that. That was a great project. So yeah.
Yeah, it seems it's craftsmanship, right?
Yeah.
So when you go and see a fine woodworker and the work they do and the angles and just like the subtle details, and then you go to the hardware store and you see, I could get that kitchen cabinet too. I see the price difference, but the craftsmanship, there's just so much more to it. And some people appreciate it and some people don't. And, that's the beauty of the world we live in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I say, like, to get offered a project like that is kind of a once in a lifetime. And I had like a couple of those at Patagonia, because the PSI vest, right, the portable surf inflation vest, was another one of those that was mind blowing and way outside my realm of expertise. The learning for me on that one was that's the first time I wasn't a subject expert or a subject matter expert on, like, I didn't really surf. And so to be asked to work on something like that, I felt really hesitant. I was like, ooh, I've always relied on my own use of the gear to judge whether it works or not. And this is an area where I'm not going to be surfing 50-foot waves, right? Like, it's just not going to happen. So I don't know what that's like. But again, through like great sort of encouragement from Randy, and Fletcher Chenard wanted to really make this because, our ambassadors were friends and kind of part of the family in a way. And their safety was incredibly important for him, which is, yeah, just that was totally an honorable thing for Patagonia to do. Like, that wasn't a product we made for commerce reasons. That was strictly a core product for safety reasons. And we just did some, again, like, reinvent the whole thing. And that was a really great one because there wasn't an existing product in the market. So it's not like, oh yeah, people have been making down jackets for a long time. How do you make a better down jacket? There was just literally nothing quite there wasn't anything for surf in that. So that was like also an incredible clean slate project in that it was, just start doing wacky stuff and see what happens. And for me, the profound gift that I was given was that my process for problem solving was applicable to things outside my area of expertise. And that's the first time I really felt like, oh, just because you aren't the subject matter expert, you can still contribute to other projects. And oftentimes you might even see things they don't because you aren't so deeply immersed in the subject matter. And that really helped me, like, to go, right, this process really is valuable and it really does work. And so, you can, like, I just felt more confident about working on more diverse projects after that. So,
maybe this is a good point to transition to the work you're doing now at Checkerspot, and where you're working on the hard science of materials innovations happening under the same roof that you're doing product design and development. So talk a little bit about what Checkerspot is, because there's definitely, like, Wonder Alpine is a name that we would all recognize. So tell me a little bit about what you're doing there and what that looks like going forward.
I mean, good fortune is obviously a part of my history, and meeting the two founders 7 or 8 years ago before they started Checkerspot, and staying in contact with them and eventually coming to work for them. That's another one of those things, like, of course, it's another startup, super risky and speculative because it's a technology based, right? And so sort of biotechnology is predicted to be one of the more important technologies in this century. And the idea that you would bring new materials to market for the first time in maybe 60 years, because all these fancy materials, whether you're talking about like Kevlar or Dyneema or whatever it might be, like, they were all invented 60 years ago. Like, we haven't really had anything new in a long, long time. And it's partially because you're making pancakes. There's only 4 ingredients. And if you only have the same 4 ingredients to make the pancakes with, you can make a lot of different kinds of pancakes. You can mix in pancakes. You can make thick, fluffy, but still you've got 4 ingredients to work with. And so at some point, the number of pancakes, the kinds of pancakes is just limited. And so essentially what checker spot is, what Scott Franklin's technology, what he just kind of spent the latter couple decades of his life working on, is we take algae, but it's not the kind of algae we all think about that grows on ponds. That's phototropic. It uses the sun and it grows and there's an algal bloom. And the people who use that kind of algae, they gather the biomass and then they try to make something from it. But this is a totally different thing where this is a kind of algae that it's heterotrophic. It doesn't rely on photosynthesis. So what we in essence do is it's like making beer. Like we have metal vats, stainless vats, and we feed the micro algae sugar, and in exchange they swell up and they make oil. Like it's crazy. I don't really understand it, but and then you just express the algae like you would olives and you get oil. And because you now don't have oil from a common source like anything we've done before, it might be someday possible to come up with new material properties because we're not making things from oil from petroleum or oil from grapeseed or one of the seed oils. It's an entirely new oil. And it just happens to have, even without any kind of manipulation, just straight out of the gate, it has pretty remarkable properties. But that's just the starting point, right? Like, so now you have an oil source and then you got to make something with the oil. So that's where you can spend a lot of time and a lot of research and money trying to figure out what to make. And so we started making polyurethanes with the oil. So, because you can make food, we do that now too, make oils for foods. And it has remarkable properties that are unlike other cooking oils. And you can make lubricants. It works really great. The problem is what should you do with it? And Scott and Charlie had a love of the outdoor industry. They identified that, for folks in our world tend to have a little higher reverence for the natural world, would be more open to a technology that would lower the footprint on the planet and on occasion maybe pay a little bit more for an emerging technology. Because let's face it, anytime you bring something like this, it just costs more in the beginning, right? There is no way around that. I mean, petroleum's had 150 years to figure out how to wring every penny out of a barrel of oil. Like they're just really good at it. It's admirable at how efficient they are. So they identified the outdoor industry as a place they could go. Like they started making foams and they brought, it just seemed like a natural thing. Like you could make skis. And so that became the first product. And then we started Wonder Alpine as the brand, the product brand side for Checker Spot. So Checker Spot's like the overall microalgae technology and how we make the oil, but then actual products, we started Wonder Alpine and started with skis, right? And it turns out once you start manipulating the oil in different ways, you can make all kinds of things. So last year we introduced finishes for textiles. So we have a wicking finish that's based off the algae. So it's got a really high bio content. So it's not petroleum derived. And we're working on other finishes like that as well that we are pretty excited about. And so, yeah, that's the rough sketch of it. It's this really unique algae that wasn't discovered that many decades ago and I think, quite rare. And we make oil. And then from that oil, we make raw materials, so polyurethane. So we make the sidewalls and the skis now out of a hard polyurethane, and we put foam in the inside for lightness. And we try to tune those properties because if you're a ski builder, you basically can buy a couple of polyurethanes off the shelf, but there's no fine tuning. So can we change the hardness and the compression and the dampening ratio? Of course, we can manipulate. And that's what's really fun to move from the outdoor industry into a science-based organization is we had a good lab at Patagonia, lots of great tools, but this is just another level, right? So that, again, for me is super fun because measuring is as important as making. So, because oftentimes you don't know how well something works or what the properties are unless you have a way to measure it, right? And so that's been really fun for me is to just hang out and see all the ways in which we can measure stuff. Yeah, so it's a pretty remarkable thing. And I think the most important thing to put into perspective with what we're doing is there are a lot of other bio-based alternatives, but the reason I signed on and why I think it's probably the most viable alternative to petroleum, because this isn't even about vilifying petroleum. It's just at some point we will run out, right? I mean, demand is going up and supply is not. So we're more efficient at extracting it. So we're in this kind of phase where we can delude ourselves into thinking it's endless, but it isn't. And so what are we going to do? Especially because most of the things in our life that are synthetic and plastic come from a barrel of oil. So there are all these wonderful alternatives, right? You can make nylon from castor beans, but once you lift up the hood, you're like, oh, right. Well, you need agricultural land. You need to water it. You need the sun. You got to make sure you don't get a pest infestation. And then in the end of the day, you ask yourself, I wonder if we should be growing food on that agricultural land. You know what I mean? Like, is that really to make nylon? At Patagonia, of course, the commitment is so great to the environment, even though that wasn't my department. You work there. You have access to all of these things and all of the ways in which Patagonia is trying to encourage these alternatives to try to make the world a better place. And the problem for me is they all work, but they all are limited in scope. They can't meet the needs and demands. And some of them are just like the impact. Like I don't know the numbers offhand, but I think like to do that, to use castor beans to make nylon, you're talking about for every kilo of oil you make, because again, you kind of start with oil as the base stock to make stuff. You're going to create, 50 kilos of CO2. And even petroleum is 3 or 4 kilos of CO2 to every kilo of oil. And they're super efficient, right? But already for us, it's 1 to 1 or 2 to 1, maybe if I'm being conservative. And that's like without scaling efficiencies and worldwide distribution, because the beauty of making the oil is it's just making beer. It's a fermentation process in a vat. You can do it anywhere in the world, right? And the feedstock is really simple. It's not specific sugar. It can be the waste product from another process and blah, blah, blah. So to me, it's like, it's the only thing that I know of, and this could change tomorrow when a new technology comes online. But right now, it's the only thing that could actually meet worldwide demand in a really carbon neutral, probably even sequester carbon at some point in the future. That's sort of when Scott does the math, you can see the pathway to that. And he is really good at doing the sums, as they say, in the Formula One world, which I love. So for me, it's like, okay, this is wildly risky once again. I don't see anything else that holds this much potential to meet this demand that we have to make all these things. So yeah, so it's a wild ride. It's exciting. No idea what the outcome will be, but kind of cool to work on something that actually could have a meaningful impact in a positive way on the planet. Because let's face it, if we're honest, all that stuff I get to work on is really just pleasure tools. They're not really making the planet a better place, if we're honest.
They're working on mental health, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we say, yeah. So maybe this is my way to pay back a little bit, is hopefully we can make this thing be 100% successful.
Yeah, I'm sure it's also very interesting from the design and development standpoint, right? Because you've got the science and the product development all under one roof, and seeing how you can kind of take this new technology and maybe the word isn't productize, but I'll just use the word productize it, right? So it's like, oh, here's the market applications, because as opposed to mad scientists in the lab making this really cool thing and then being like, I wonder what the world will do with this. You're kind of combining that together and say, well, here's this really interesting technology. Now we're going to show you all the different ways that you could apply this to products in the real world. That seems to me like a very unique and interesting approach, especially for the outdoor industry.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, like in a dynamic materials analysis machine, like it's just not something you'd find in anybody's lab at an outdoor brand, right? And the ability to do that, and we have a ton of PhDs, right? Like biologists, chemists, material scientists, and that's what you need to do this. Like it's a big, big lift, right? Like trying to change our reliance on petroleum and have an alternative for the future, right? Because what are future generations going to do when there's no oil? So we need some kind of thing. Yeah. So, and as a result of that, we get people at the beginning of their career arc that want to work for us, and it's generally attracts really awesome people because it resonates. That messaging resonates. It's the same for Patagonia, right? They tend to get a lot of really awesome candidates for a job because the messaging resonates for people, right? And so in that case, we've been really fortunate in that the people that are in the organization are pretty phenomenal for the most part. And again, kind of a privilege to have that. But
sure. It's good. You're solving interesting problems will attract interesting people.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's fun to solve problems and maybe they have a large impact on the world. It's, wow, kind of great.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Casey, I really appreciate your time in this. I do want to end with a couple of rapid fire questions. They don't have to be rapid fire answered because that's why I have you here, because I like that you can just expound on things. It's wonderful. So I'll lay them out there and then you have at them. I'm curious what your experience as a climber has taught you about risk and how you look at taking risks.
Yeah. It's a great question, right? Again, because I like to look a little deeper, it'd be easy to just say that risk is one of the reasons why these things happen. Risk's a funny thing. Like what I said earlier about risk leads to breakthroughs. Breakthroughs build companies, and then companies become risk averse, right? It's a neat little soundbite, but risk is a powerful thing, but in isolation, it can be misleading. And what I mean by that is without discretion, risk is reckless, right? But with discretion, it becomes a tool that can provide powerful breakthroughs. And so for me, I think one of the things, it's just, again, it's a personality thing, but I was drawn to risk. So that is, again, just the chemical wiring that I came into the world with, because when I started climbing, cams hadn't quite come out yet. And it was like, it felt like risky, certainly of having 3 nuts on my rack and being like, yeah, you just are not falling off. That's just not an option on the table, right? And yet still going back for more. Like there's, you gotta have, it's gotta work for you, right?
So, aesthetic protection, as you say.
Yeah. Like marginal psychological protection, and doing lots of dumb stuff like that in those early days. But then I think as I got better at what I did, I realized because I really like analyzing things, I would analyze situations and risk. And so the two together are awesome because then when you should take the risk, or you have a pretty good idea and you have a really good track record of it and you don't do it recklessly. And at that point, I think risk becomes a really powerful tool. But if you just say, oh, let's just take risks, like it'll work out. That's more like a gambling. That's a lottery ticket. Like, yeah, I'm a good person. I should win, right? And it's like, oh man, the odds, you know what the odds are? The chances are, if you do it as a hobby, that's one thing, but as a strategy, maybe that's not a good strategy, right? So I think it's important to say that those things go together. And for me, I think that's one of the reasons why I've been able to come up with some ideas is I tend to be pretty honest. And I think that's because in the mountains, taking needless risk is a bad idea. You have to be honest with yourself. And even about when it's not like super risky, you should just be honest in your assessment, right? Same thing, like I said earlier, like, what are you passionate about? Like, be honest with yourself. Don't say, oh, I love this, when really you probably don't. And so, like, when I wanted to solo a couple routes in Zion, I just was like, okay, let's go to the crag when no one's around. Let's and I mean rope soloing, and let's work through the systems. And let's be like brutally honest. Can you come up with a clever way to set up the belay that's maybe a little different than other people? And are you using a solo aid, or are you tying a clove hitch and blah, blah, blah? And then go through the pitches on the route, even though maybe you haven't climbed it. In this case, I hadn't climbed one of the routes I did. And you're just honest with yourself and you're like, okay, here's how many hours this is going to take. I can do this in a day. So I'm not going to, which is awesome because now I don't have to lug stuff around because it's already a ton of work. And if you come out somewhere in the window of what you predicted, then I think your self-assessment's pretty honest, right? And then you start to trust your judgment more, which is, I think, really important. You have to have the confidence, right? Because again, taking a risk is difficult. So you need to judge it well. And then you need to have the confidence that once you commit, there's a good chance you're going to be successful, and try to convince the people around you that you will be, because that's an uphill battle we don't really talk about in innovation, is that it's a disruptive process. It disrupts people's status quo, and people are often struggle with that. And we'll be like, oh, why do you want to do that? Or I'll suggest something. And the classic answer is I'll ask, because that's kind of how I approach it now. And like, why are we doing that like that? Well, that's how it's always been done. In the beginning, you leave it there. But now I'm like, well, walk me through the origin process. Like, what was happening at the time that led to this particular technique being the technique of choice? Oh, well, we were making this thing, we're doing that thing. It's like, well, you haven't made that in 2 decades. And the process you're using right now is quite troublesome for the thing you're trying to make today. So what do you think we maybe talk about some alternative ways to do this, right? And that's just really hard for people. They feel like you're pulling the rug out from underneath them and the sky is falling. And this has nothing to do with risk. It's just the process of trying to bring new ideas to bear, right? Which is, it's a disruptive process. And I think if I'm honest, right, like I know I haven't always been the best messenger with my disruption.
That comes with age.
Isn't this obvious to you? Which of course it isn't, right? And it's condescending to say it like that. Yeah, for me, it's super obvious, right? And because again, like that risk, analyzing my honesty about what could the outcome, like I'm pretty confident in that now. So when I say, I think we should try this, even though it's going to make you uncomfortable, I'm already like 80% certain it's going to work. But nevertheless, you got to make space for people. And perhaps I've been impatient over the years where I'm just like, catch up, instead of like just waiting, get everybody on the bus and then be like, everybody's on the bus. How cool. So that would be a piece of advice, maybe, of course, I would share with others is you might see things other people don't see. You got to give them a chance to catch up.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's really good. I'm going to ask.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, risk's really important, but within the context of using it wisely and having good judgment. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase, risk as a tool. I like that. That's something to think about for sure and apply. I'm going to ask you a question that you like to ask other people. What do you think is a recent genius product that you've seen?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I don't have an answer off the top of my head. Or something I was looking at. Well, I'm going to endorse this and I don't actually know if it works yet because I haven't tried it. So like sometimes I come to things through the theoretical, and maybe I can go either way. It can be through the practical and personal experience, or it can be through the theoretical. I've noticed that I can learn from books, no problem. Like I can read stuff and understand, and then I can use my hands to solve problems. Right. And it's kind of nice to be able to do both. Well, I think that, I was just looking at this because a friend suggested it. I love wool, but not everybody can wear wool. And there are shortcomings to wool, even though it's a massively important product. And I think what the new yarn folks are doing on paper, so that's my personal caveat because I haven't actually tested these products. On paper, it appeals to and dovetails totally to what we talked about earlier with air permeable insulation. It's using that same concept. So of course, I see that and I'm like, okay, I'm immediately drawn to that as a solution because I understand it. But what they're doing, I think, might have the potential to make wool even better than it already has been for the last decade and a half. So that's a pretty cool thing. So that's next on the list, is to order a couple of shirts and start doing stuff outside and see if I can tell a difference, see if it's real or not. But that could be cool. I will say that the filter in the squeeze bottle is, once I got turned on to that by someone else, I was like, man, this is incredible. Now I'm proselytizing about it. It's like, you got one of these things,
I will second that endorsement. I got one last year, and I do a lot of fly fishing. And now the fact that I don't have to carry a bottle of water with me, I'm always in the water.
Yeah.
And if you're out in the backcountry for like 12 hours, like that's a lot of water. I don't want to filter it. Now it's like, oh, it's right there. And when I don't use it, it just rolls back up. It's an amazing, it deserves all of the shouts that it gets.
Oh man, if we could just have a little like stream, a little, drip coming down next to the nose and El Cap. So you could just, oh, gee, that would be pretty awesome.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so the last question this is the question I always end with is, how do you define success for yourself?
Yeah, it goes back to sort of my definition of innovation. I think like that, that achieving the best balance that I can at the time is like the most incredible internal feeling. And like it just sort of, and I know, as I said, there's a litmus for things for me. And one of the litmuses of my own sort of joy in the moment is like, do I start singing, or do I have that kind of like, back of the neck, hair standing up, kind of shiver sort of feeling about what I'm working on? That's usually a pretty good indication that things are coming together. So I do define it as achieving this just beautiful symmetric, like, well, it doesn't have to be symmetrical, but this balance, because of course it's not symmetrical. And honestly, in climbing, that's evolved for me over the years too. And that in the physical realm, that's also true. Like this is a struggle for me because I started in a time where you don't fall and ground up and super traditional. But I don't climb anymore I try, it's a struggle, right? It's a process, but I try to push the idea of a red point or an on-site away. That isn't why I'm climbing now with all these years of climbing. And that's the thing, is I still really love rock climbing. Like I don't know why, but I still really love it. I don't have the drive and desire that I had when I was younger, but like any day that I go out, I still really love it. And I'm still trying to climb well. And, but it now becomes about like, how do I move? So I imagine I'm in conversation with the rock, and the rock is animate, and the rock goes, oh, you could have thrust through that move and done the onside, but instead you hung because you realized you were starting to disrespect the natural sort of selection of the holds and the body position necessary to use them effectively and efficiently and beautifully. And so I can't always do it. You get carried away and they're like, oh, I'll buy you a beer if you send the route, But yeah, it's more important for me. And I will purposely do that sometimes, even if I've gone past a crux, but I felt like I did it really poorly. And I know I can make it to the chains without falling. I will just sit and be like, okay, that was not how that should be done. Let's lower back down and let's try that 3 or 4 more times and find out, such that you imagine in this conversation, this imaginary conversation with the rock says to you, thank you. We appreciate that you took the time to find the way that suits both your physical body, your limitations, your strengths, and what was available to, sort of gracefully and artfully move through this section in a way that, just it's kind of fluid, right? And so feeling that fluidity is what I feel when I rock climb in that manner. And it's also the feeling I get when I solve problems, particularly if I'm using my hands and I'm in that zone and I'm doing a really good job. That feeling is the same feeling. Yeah, it's this, you're in this fluid state and nothing's choppy and staccato. Even though like you can make a really powerful dynamic move climbing or something, and it can still be executed in a way. And it's funny because just the other day, with one of my early climbing partners was from Austria, and we would sometimes be halfway up a long route and we just sit on a ledge for 2 hours and talk about art and how to move. And we had this thing like, touch your feet softly to the rock, right? Don't thrash, don't pedal. And that was a new concept for me. So, because I was coming from this old school, like thrash up there, throw in the hand, and anyway, he would tell me like, oh, there was this film about Patrick Edlanger, and like just funny on YouTube the other day, I finally saw like one of these things, and you can like translate it, into English, right? It's kind of lousy, but you can do it. Life, I don't know the translation directly, but life at the fingertips or something, right? And I remember from 20 years ago, him just describing what it meant to him and what this little film about him in his early days was like. And when I watched that, I was like, oh, right. The way he's moving in the Verdun. And then like when he's at the top and he gets a guy to lower him back in, and you see the guy at the top, right? You don't see him getting lowered down. You think, oh, he's going to work some pitch, right? And the guy pulls the rope back up, and the shirt, the shoes, everything's off. And then, the camera goes down on him. He's soloing barefoot at the top of the Verdun Gorge, right? Just moving absolutely stunningly. I could feel that in my body, right? I was like, that's what it is for me. That is like success, innovation, fluid. Yeah, it was just the whole thing for me, right? Problem solving in a graceful way. So
that's a wonderfully unique definition of success that I believe that only you could deliver to us. And I really appreciate that. No, I mean that in a very honest way. Like, Casey, I really appreciate your unique outlook. And I remember this from the first time we met years ago on a hot trip together. I still remember some of those things you said because your combination of intensity in a good way. I don't mean that in bad intensity. Like that, the balance you have between your curiosity and your intensity and your desire to actually have fun doing it is, it's palpable, and it's good. And I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation, and hopefully that more people can hear your way of thinking. And I know that there's so much that you've brought to people's minds to think about, especially the Casey Shaw theory of comfort. I think that is a very interesting, and I feel like that's around to feel like there's a whole episode there where we could just talk about that whole theory of comfort and how it applies to product design. Because to me, that's really changed my perspective. What you said was really kind of changed my perspective of what we look at when we consider innovation.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Christian. I appreciate that kind words. I have a question for you.
Okay.
What's a book that you've read in the last, couple of years that you've found really profound or impactful, or you really took some lessons from that you felt like you'd want to incorporate into your day to day?
I'll give you a few. There's one that's called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. It's very short. You could probably read it on a toilet if you really wanted to. It's the story of, he's literally a lion tracker in South Africa. His name is Boyd Vardy. Is that his last name? I think so. It's super interesting. I've listened to it. I've read it. I've gifted it to a bunch of people. I really like that book. It's simple. It's simple. One book that I just bought 4 copies of to give to people is called Excellent Advice for Living by Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly is the original founder of Wired. He is one of the most interesting people I've ever read. He's a technologist, but he's also part Amish in a lot of ways. So he's a super interesting guy. And it really is literally just things that he's typed out to hand over to his grown kids. And they're just phrases. And I'll read them in the morning. I'll just read a page of them, and it's just little interesting nuggets. There's some super basic stuff in there, but I love that one. And then one that's a little bit different is called Same as Ever by a guy named Morgan Housel. Morgan Housel is my favorite writer. Strangely enough, he's an economist. So he's not an economist, but he writes about investing and the economy. But he's more of he loves history. And so this idea of the book is Same as Ever is basically looking back to show us through history all these things that we project forward. We've been projecting those things forward throughout history, and here's real evidence of the stories behind those historical moments or those thinkings of the stock market will go forever. Real estate is the best investment. He's using it in economic terms, but it's way broader than that. So anything that he writes, I'll listen to and read because he's just a very good writer. So there's 3 randoms for you.
Those are great. I haven't read any of them. So awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And all of them are maybe that says a lot about me. They're very easy read.
Well, people take things on board more easily if they can, if they have the patience to get through them. So easy is good, right? And also it's a sign that maybe the way they're writing is really good.
It's for sure. And I mean, I balance it by reading Eric Larson. Do you know the story in Eric Larson? He wrote a really interesting book about Lusitania. He wrote a really interesting book about the first year of the Blitz, Winston Churchill's first year. in office. And now I'm reading his book on this, on the first year that Lincoln came into presidency and the lead up to the, the Civil War and that. Yeah, so it goes back to the kind of the same as ever, that other book by Morgan Housel. It's like we think that our problems are so unique and modern, and I'm just convinced that they're 100,000 years old. We're just reliving the same issues over and over again, variations on the same theme. So yeah, that's a good one too.
Yeah. I mean, it's true, right? I mean, that expression about those who forget their past are bound to repeat it, right? And I think maybe it's one of the reasons why in school I didn't think much about history, but why studying, the greats like Paul Press and climbing, right, soloing, and I don't know, whatever it was, 1908 and doing first ascents, and like understanding what came before, I think in some ways has helped me look forward a little bit and realize, oh yeah, that's the same problem we had 2 centuries ago. I have better tools and better technology, but it's really the same problem we're trying to solve, and you're not really that special.
Yeah.
Is the healthy takeaway.
Exactly. I mean, just reading biographies is the best antidote for that. We're just reliving things over and over again. Or the other one is just like, we look back on people and we're like, oh, they must have really had it figured out. And then you read their biography, like, oh my God, until the day they died, they were batshit crazy. Do you know what I mean? It was just the inside of, I'm convinced that inside of every successful business or organization is a bit of a gong show. There's all these other good things that we just don't get to see. But I love that because it just reminds me, oh yeah. I feel like a gong show sometimes, and I feel much better when I read about Winston Churchill and these other great leaders who are like, oh yeah, they have some crazy stuff going on too.
Oh yeah, like people will ask me that, about, oh, you've worked at these amazing organizations, it must have been so great. It's like, no. Every organization is like every family, utterly dysfunctional, but they all have their unique dysfunctional DNA. And so if you fit in that, boy, that's your people, that's your clan, and you can get some stuff done. But to think they are, functioning without friction, that's an illusion.
Yeah. You just got to go find your fun in the dysfunction. That's all.
Yeah. Well, if they, like, as I say, if they have what you need, it can be incredibly fun and rewarding.
Yes. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Casey. It is such a pleasure chatting with you. I look forward to the next time we get to do it.
Yeah. Likewise. Let's go skiing again sometime. We need Rob to make that happen. So
yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end of this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend you think may enjoy it too. Sharing goes a long way. You can also take a few seconds to subscribe to the podcast or hit that like button. Anything you do to help share the love here, we'd appreciate it. Thanks so much for following along, and we'll see you next time.